yourself. Perfect.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Marthe Wens. I'm a PhD candidate at the Institute for Environmental Studies at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. And I'll present my PhD research on integrating farmers' adaptation behavior and dynamics in drought risk modeling. So yesterday in the Dutch national media, there was this article about the worst drought in 40 years that causes hunger in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia. And this is like a news article that, well, many of you will recognize. And also scientists actually predicted this drought 2 years ago. They were saying, okay, there is gonna be a very dry period. And they even suggested measures how people have to prepare themselves for this drought. And then we had, of course, a lot of Facebook experts that were complaining because they've been giving money to this region for 40 years and we're wondering where all the money went because people apparently are still not resilient or still vulnerable to this drought. And well, I don't agree with most of what these Facebook experts were saying. They kind of pose an interesting question. How come a region so frequently hit by droughts is still quite vulnerable to it? Because, well, we know over time, risk changes. And if we include climate change and increasing drought frequencies, and we include population growth, then we will see an increasing risk, as you can see on the top line here. That is, of course, assuming that there is no adaptation taking place. Nobody is adapting to this. If, and that's what these Facebook experts were referring to, people are behaving very economic rational and they take up many adaptation measures that are cost efficient, then, well, people might be able to lower the risk or keep the risk low over time. However, what we actually observe is something, in between. It's a bounded rational behavior, and this behavior is influenced by the occurrence of actual drought impacts, and also influenced by barriers that might actually limit the adoption of new adaptation measures. And what we at the AVM wanted to do, and what I did for my PhD research, is trying to create a drought risk model that includes this bounded rational behavior. So that includes these dynamics of vulnerability over time. And so I did that by creating the model ADOPT. It's an agent-based model. And as you can see here, it combines an agricultural production module with adaptation decisions, so a human module. It's a socio-hydrological setup because this agricultural production model influences the adaptation decisions through agricultural yield, through farm income, and adaptation decisions also influence this agricultural production module through these farm decisions, these adaptation decisions. And so we run this model for a past case study, and in what comes, I will explain how we built a model, and I also will explain some of the applications for future scenarios that we run with this model. So first of all, we applied this model on a semi-arid case in Kitui. It's a region in Kenya, which is inhabited mainly by smallholder farmers. And most of these smallholder farmers, they grow maize because maize is a staple crop in this region. And we looked into 4 different adaptation measures, on-farm measures that the farmers themselves could take. So we looked into mulching, which is a way of covering the soil to reduce evapotranspiration. Vineyard terraces, which is a local measure that reduces the slope, so it increases infiltration. Then we looked into the adoption of shallow wells, which is a way of getting water to irrigate maybe manually your crops or to connect to a drip irrigation system to automatically irrigate the crops. So we looked into the adoption of these 4 adaptation measures. Then we looked into, the weather that can influence this agricultural production, and we used CFSR data and SHRBS data for the past to historic model. And we also looked into the trends of these data. So we saw that there is actually a decreasing rainfall trend and an increasing temperature trend visible for this region in this data. And we used this trend to have a future scenario of a drier future, a hotter future, and a drier, hotter future. However, if you look into global circulation models, often for this region, they project a wettening trend. So we also reversed the visible rainfall trend to have a scenario that presents a wetter future and a wetter, hotter future. So running all these future weather conditions, we could estimate crop yields. We used the AquaCrop OS model for this. This is a FAO-based model that simulates daily crop growth. And besides taking into account daily weather conditions or climate change scenarios, it's also able to include the effect of on-farm water management measures, so of these adaptation measures that I just showed. On the graph here on the left, you can see the rainfall conditions. So what would be the yield if no adaptation measures are taken? And right of it, you can see these 4 measures, on-farm measures, and also combinations of them. And of course, we can see happily that they all have a positive influence on the crop yield. Okay, so this is our agricultural module of the ADOPT model. Now let's go to the human module, the adaptation decision module. For this, first we went to Kitui, to this region in Kenya, and we asked stakeholders and local experts about the drought risk context in this region. So what causes drought risk? What are the common adaptation measures? What are factors that influence this adaptation? And what is, let's say, the socioeconomic and institutional context that actually influence these factors? Besides, we also looked into literature on existing theories, economic, psychological theories that could explain such adaptive behavior. And we found that the protection motivation theory actually had many factors that were also visible in this fuzzy cognitive mapping exercise we did. This protection motivation theory states that threat appraisal and coping appraisal influence people's intention to adapt, so their intention to adopt new measures. Threat appraisal, you can understand as the memory of people about past droughts being influenced by how frequent they were and how severe they were. Coping appraisal, it's people's perception about the adaptation measures costs and the benefits of these adaptation measures, but also their self-efficacy, how capable they are to adopt new adaptation measures. Then we also did a larger survey. We did a questionnaire among 260 households to evaluate their past adaptation behavior, so the measure they already have adopted. And for example, we saw here that believing in your own capacity, which you can see in the center here, actually significantly is linked to having adopted measures in the past. So this is again a factor of the protection motivation theory that proved significant here. What we also saw is actually that many factors like age, education, and gender influence this link between psychological factors and adopting adaptation measures. So there is a large heterogeneity in this data set. And that actually showed that our choice for an agent-based approach, because we made an agent-based model, is actually a very promising approach. Okay, so next to the past behavior, we also wanted to have an idea of potential future scenarios, potential future scenarios to include in our model. And so we looked into 4 top-down measures that, for example, governments or NGOs can take, increasing the amount of extension services, so trainings for farmers, improving the existing early warning systems. Instead of paying people after a drought would happen, creating ex-ante cash transfers so people can really prepare themselves, and allowing people to access the credit market by opening by having better credit schemes. These are all measures that are also present in the Kenya policy documents. And we use them to evaluate the effect of these interventions on the adoption of adaptation measures. Okay, so this is our ADOPT model. Let's now see what the results could be, or what the results are based on the scenarios that we run. So if we look into these 4 interventions, these 4 government interventions, we see that they actually increase people's adaptation intention because they increase the adoption of mulching, vineyard terraces, shallow wells, and drip irrigation, compared to a government that is reactive and that doesn't do any of these interventions. If we would combine early warning systems and ex-ante cash transfers, so have these 2 interventions at the same time, let's say that's a proactive stance where the government is really focusing on preparedness of the population in the face of droughts, then we see, and that's on the green line here, that there is actually a larger increase in the adoption of adaptation measures. So there is actually an even more positive result. If we combine all 4 interventions, so let's say this is a strategic government, a government that really goes into reducing the vulnerability in a sustainable way, then we see that the adoption of adaptation measures is actually even higher. There is a non-linear effect. Even under all different climate change scenarios, we see an increased adoption of adaptation measures. What we're most interested in, of course, is how this affects drought risk. And so we looked into the effect of these on food production, on poverty rates, and on emergency aid needs. What we can see on all of these three graphs is that this strategic scenario where we combine all 4 interventions has, of course, the most positive effect on drought risk. Under the reactive scenario, we actually see a decreasing food production under most climate change scenarios, and we see an increasing poverty rate. What is interesting, though, is that this effect of this strategic scenario, let's say, it only is very visible after a few years. It takes a decade or 2 before this government or this top-down interventions actually influence drought risk of these smallholder farmers. What further is also evident is that this proactive approach, if you look into the right figure, it actually helps, but not under all climate change scenarios. In a dry and hot future, only the strategic approach is able to reduce the emergency aid needs as compared to the current day emergency aid needs. So if we go back to this article of the Dutch national media and to this scientist predicting this drought, I would tell them, we really not only need to look into proactive measures, but into the sustainable vulnerability reducing interventions that can really support smallholder farmers to take actions themselves to take away multiple barriers for adaptation at the same time. And I would also say to have some patience, because it takes a while before these effects are really visible. So if we want to achieve the SDGs and the Sunday framework, we need models that are able to include this vulnerability dynamics, to really have these risk dynamics in a heterogeneous way, because of course these effects are different on different types of households. It's also something we saw. And we proved that an agent-based modeling approach, the ADOPT model that we now presented, is actually a way of doing so. It has some promising results. Of course, there needs to be more validation steps. Now it's more a proof of concept, but in order to become a predictive decision support tool, of course, we need a few extra steps of validation. So I want to thank all my co-authors, the people that helped me develop this model and explore its application. And I want to thank all of you for listening. Thank you.